So Mark's question today was, okay, George Crumb's Winds of Destiny opens with a version of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Is that song belong to George W. Bush or Barack Obama?
And are we surprised that they could be contending for it?
To put it another way, what is the role of music in war and in a time of war? And what is the role of artists? George Crumb came out with Black Angels, a piece we talked about earlier that will be played by a version of it will be played by the Australian Chamber Orchestra. And it was a piece that courageously and really boldly addressed the nightmare of the Vietnam War in ways that television couldn't touch, and in ways that Hollywood movies couldn't touch. The power of very great music to go under the skin, behind the propaganda, and reach to a place that was deeper than the rationalizations. It makes Black Angels simply one of the great anti-war pieces in the history of art. I would love to talk a bit we'll talk with George Crumb tonight as at the beginning of the concert about some of his thoughts as he was composing Winds of Destiny in 2003, 2004. And some of the things that were on his mind that had him choose these songs, this material. The piece consists of first the Battle Hymn of the Republic, then George Crumb has made a setting of When Johnny Comes Marching Home, then A Lonesome Road, 12 Gates into the City, a song which evokes the book of Revelation, but of course music written by slaves who were thrown out of every city that they entered. And so there's that great verse of when I get to heaven, there's nobody up there who can turn me out. And that is to say, these are songs of jubilation written by people who know an amount of day-to-day suffering and whose way to approach that suffering is through joy, and whose vision of the golden city of the apocalypse is so breathtakingly beautiful. But also in George's setting, it's impossible not to also think of Fallujah and what it means to go through a city with 12 gates. And oh, what a beautiful city. And what does it mean that in our generation we've taken a number of the holy cities filled with the tombs and the temples built around saints. A lot of Muslim holy sites, Najaf, Karbala, the site of Hussein's martyrdom, and pulverized them. You know, which if you were doing to Chartres Cathedral, someone in the West would have a problem with, but because we don't know that Karbala is a sacred site, we don't know what the mosque in Najaf represents, and it's not just a graveyard next to the mosque, those are shrines to saints where people come and are healed. And that's now pulverized into dust by US airstrikes, because it looked like someone was hiding out there. And so those coordinate numbers are called in. And one of the intense parts of course, doing research to do the small production you'll see tonight, the role of women in war, the new role of women in the US military, which is very, very intense because women have never been so present in military conflict before this conflict. And there's a new organization that has been formed by women veterans, a SWAN, Service Women's Action Network, because all of the veterans organizations run by men were run for men. And women have other issues and other things they need. But also the presence of women in war makes you ask new questions about war and makes you understand war differently. And I hope some of that is what we're able to put on stage with Dawn Upshaw tonight, using George Crumb's haunting music. That is not a propaganda statement, it's just a very haunted place where you face the things that haunt you. And George Crumb has made a deep, deep, resonating echo chamber for your own conscience, where finally you can hear your own still small voice come back to you that normally gets obliterated in all the noise that surrounds us. Just to finish with Najaf, I don't know why I went off on this, but just to say, Mark, one of the heartbreaking things, there's a bunch of memoirs of women who are trying to get equal treatment in the U.S. military, and a woman Air Force pilot who's one of 4 in her little team, and the rest are men, and they all eat together, they all do everything together, and she's left out. And she finally needs to, she needs to show she's one of the guys. And she's African American, and so there's another dimension all at play in this. So I'm reading her memoir, and she says, well, they called in the court points, and I was so relieved. It was this weird graveyard next to a mosque, and there was somebody seen down there, and I took the whole thing out, and finally I was one of the guys and was accepted. And of course, she's wrote that in her memoir as the proudest day of her life, and she would, of course, have no idea what Najaf was, that she had just taken out. And we're in the middle of, a place, imagine the Iraqi and Afghani armies coming and going door to door in Beverly Hills, Santa Monica, and Ojai, removing all males under 25 and taking them to some giant place where you will never find them again. Imagine how long that would last here in America. And also they don't speak English, and you look suspicious, so that's enough. Or you resist. So we're in the middle of a really complicated cultural question as well with the wars that we're in the middle of. And one of the things that really upsets me is they're only reported as factoids, and they're only reported, they're not reported culturally. There's not an understanding that, what's at stake between people is also cultural. And if you're unable to read someone culturally, if you're unable to contextualize somebody's life, or indeed unable to contextualize your own life culturally, you're in trouble in this world. And you will destroy a lot of things, including your own future. And that's a lot what we're in the middle of for the stakes of culture being part of the national discussion. And what it meant when culture was deliberately removed from the national discussion by a group of politicians who knew exactly what they were doing, by cutting all the arts budgets, because everyone would prefer No Child Left Behind, in which we have taught a generation now, it's now 10 years, a generation of American school children have been taught to answer back correctly the answer you were given. Not to question, not to think independently, not to come up with an alternative. And we've now trained a generation to think this way, Pavlovian style. And we are right now credentialing and privileging the students who are most adept at that. And the politicians who organize that know exactly what they're doing, because the arts are an extremely dangerous place where questions are asked and where odd echoes that don't fit the picture keep resonating, as in the music of George Crumb. And that echo chamber where you are with your conscience and you are with your own deeper thoughts and your own better ideas and your own still small voice that says this isn't right, but we managed to silence that. What does it mean to create a space where we can all hear that voice and then act upon it? That's hopefully why the arts exist. And I would like to just go back to you, Mark, and one of the things that I love about Mark is he teaches these journalism classes and uses Tolstoy, Goethe, and Sophocles as the primary texts. And you've just come from teaching War and Peace the entire last year. And I was wondering if you just give us a short version of Tolstoy for journalists. What does it mean that, Tolstoy does keep insisting on asking a larger question when it comes to war and when it comes to peace? And even that it took Tolstoy to include peace. We haven't even gotten there. We put the period at war. Nobody could write a book called War and Peace now. You can only write a book called War, because peace is something people can't even imagine.
Thanks for that question, Peter. Tolstoy, many people don't know, began as a war correspondent. His first well-known publications were called the Sebastopol sketches, or the Sebastopol tales, that he wrote when he was a soldier in the Crimean War. And the Tsar was so excited about these, he had them translated into French so people could read them in the elite, many of whom didn't read Russian. And they're astonishing, frightening, vivid, bloody, and eventually outraged depictions of what war is actually like. In fact, what's striking about them, there are three of them, spanning 6 months, 3 different dispatches. And the first one was the one that so excited the Tsar that he had it translated and distributed, because it seemed to be very gung-ho about the war. And by the third sketch, you have this absolute fascination with death and what death is. Death and heroism. And this, it's safe to say, the Tsar did not want translated, because it is a horrible and bloody depiction, which is later echoed very much in War and Peace, in the depiction of extremely bloody, extremely grim depictions of war, and people discovering the grimness. I mean, there are a series of characters in War and Peace, and actually elsewhere in his work, who go through a kind of a transit from heroism to depression and disgust, which is a transit that Tolstoy himself followed. I'd like to say, just thinking about what Peter was just talking about with the arts, music, its relation in war, of course, we think here, sitting here, anticipating this great work of George Crumb's tonight, we're thinking of war as of music as an anti-war illuminating force. But of course, music's certainly original purpose when it comes to war was as a pro-war force, as a marching song, as a bugle communication across the battlefield, as anything that ups the blood and ups the intensity and puts men's psyche, because until recently it was men as organized fighters, in a state where they can kill and kill and kill and risk being killed. And it's interesting, I wanted to begin with those statements from Barack Obama and also from that song that we all know so well, to point out this contradiction that on the one hand we want to give war a moral mission, and our politicians are compelled to do that. Our leaders are compelled to do it. They do it again and again and again. And for a time, the population, the people absorbed this message. And the Iraq War was no exception to that. And there is eventually a kind of enlightenment on the part of the population. The longer the war goes on, the more casualties there are. And Iraq, of course, is striking, among other things, in the ratio of casualties to dead, which is anywhere between 7 and 9 to 1. As recently as Vietnam, it was 4 to 1. And this means essentially that people are surviving wounds, catastrophic wounds, that would have, within the last 20 years, certainly killed them, and now leave them maimed and sometimes horribly maimed for the rest of their lives. So the population is inspired by this moral message, but the soldiers, and I think we should swing back to them, the people who are actually fighting, learn something very quickly, which is war is about war. War is about power. War is about killing. And though we have laws of war, and we talk about laws of war, and we talk about rules of engagement and how you can't kill civilians and various other things, in fact, war is about, in its essence, killing. And it was driven home to me when I was covering Iraq, actually this was right outside of Fallujah, where I saw an attack. American soldiers essentially shoot into a convoy of civilians and kill 8 or 9 of them. And by the time I actually got to the scene, I saw it at a distance. By the time I actually got there, there were nothing but corpses and a couple of wounded, and the Americans had gone, long gone. And eventually some more Americans showed up. They didn't know anything about the original Americans. And this is kind of this surreal thing, this bright day, bright sun, bright blue sky, and mystery over everything, except the corpses lying on the ground, who were civilians. Anyway, to make a very long story short, I made it my mission to try to find these original soldiers. Who were these people who actually did the killing within 1,000 meters of where I was? And how did they get away so quickly? And I eventually found one of them, an amazing guy, a lieutenant, very young man, hadn't gotten to Iraq very long before, beautiful, absolutely beautiful face, 22 years old, lieutenant, West Point graduate. And I told him, these are civilians, and he said, oh, really? Well, one of them had a phone to his ear, and there was an explosion in the distance, and we thought he was calling in an IED. IED being, of course, improvised explosive devices, which are buried under the road. And when they blow up, you lose legs, you lose arms, you lose a chunk of your face. This is how that war was fought, asymmetric warfare. So they heard this explosion in the distance, they saw these people driving next to them, one of them had a cell phone to his ear, and they shot them. Bam. And I said to him, did you know this? They were, no, didn't know it. This guy was a perfectly nice guy, well-trained. And a soldier was coming by during this interview, and he said, you're talking to Scott, eh? He's a fucking IED magnet. Do you know that? He's a fucking IED magnet, which meant every time he went out, this lieutenant, an IED would blow up somewhere near them. And I looked at this guy, and I can't tell you, this guy, extremely charming, young guy. And I said, an IED magnet. So when you go out, what do you think? Do you think that your number is eventually going to be up? Do you think that is it luck? Are you charmed? What do you think about this? And this young man looked at me with this pitying look, which told me that I would just never, ever, ever get it. That's what he was communicating to me. And he said, you don't understand, this is war. They shoot at us, we shoot at them. They shoot at us, we shoot at them. Some days, they shoot better than we do. And then he got up and left. And I was doing this interview on camera, and the cameraman just looked at me and said, do you fucking believe what that guy? Well, the coda to this is I got back to the US about a week later, and in my email queue was his name. And I thought, as so often, he's writing me to say, when is this piece coming out? When is this going to happen? I thought, I clicked on it, and it was from his father. And his father was writing because he heard I'd done the interview, and his son had been killed the next day with, of course, an IED, improvised explosive device.